Make way in the King's name. A blessing on the righteous colony of Massachusetts, where iniquity is dragged into the sunlight. Know all men by these presents that Mistress Roger Prynne has been ordered to bear punishment for the crimes of fornication and adultery.
Published in 1850, The Scarlet Letter is one of the great masterpieces of American literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne sets his story in Boston, New England, in the 18th century, when American colonies lived under the religious and moral dictatorship of the Puritans. Here, the Puritan society of those times has condemned the main character of the novel, Esther Prynne, to the stocks, together with her child, born of an extramarital fling with an unknown man whose identity Esther refuses to reveal. For this reason, she is forced to carry a big crimson letter A on her chest, so as to make her sin public. That having been said, the woman doesn't allow this to get her down, but instead has the letter embroidered on her chest in gold to show her strength, and carries it as a badge of honor. Ironically, her lover is no other than the local reverend and the most pious man in the community, Arthur Dimmesdale, who is consumed by guilt at his deed and at his inability to come out and acknowledge the child as his own because of the dogmas set by his fate and for the fear of public opinion. And so this guilt, this contrition, starts to affect his health, which worsens day after day. But it's not these feelings alone that affect the Reverend so. The day of Esther's sentence, her long-lost and believed dead husband reappears in the city under the name of Roger Chillingworth, a charade that Esther is sworn not to reveal. He yearns to discover her wife's lover and to force him to acknowledge his deed, and so, having suspicions about the Reverend, he decides to press him psychologically, shadowing him, worsening his health, and hoping that he will eventually give way. And so, all throughout the novel, we see a darker side pictured by the Reverend and Roger, and a lighter side, Esther, who is the very image of willpower and spirit. Following the sentence, the woman only grows stronger, defying all the Puritan rules of the times, and redeeming herself completely from the flawed society that pushed her at the borders of the village and condemned her for her immoral deeds. Esther will not only commit good deeds, helping her people and making the most of her ability in sewing, but will also protect her Pearl, a complex but central character who, because of her fleeting and otherworldly presence in the story, is more akin to an elf than a child. The community sees her as hellspawn for this characteristic, although the other interpretations of the novel suggest a more benign vision, as a character that encompasses good and evil, good because of her strength, evil because of her origins, being born out of wedlock. The author doesn't just find the perfect way to describe a corrupted and hypocrite society, like the Puritan one Esther lived in, making this novel current in any century, but with its simplicity and its strong symbolism encompasses all those themes that will then develop in American literature and cinematography, like those of morality, sin, guilt, and social redemption. Indeed, if one thinks of the evolution of some themes and symbols in the novel, one of the things that stand out is the evolution of the letter A that Esther carries, which starts out to indicate adulterer, but that then evolves into her ability in sewing, and then into her angelical dispensation by the Reverend's own admission. Hawthorne played with many meanings of the letter, like linking it right away with a character, Arthur Dimmesdale, and if we want to find out other examples of this, the letter P comes to mind, P for Pearl, his daughter. Prynne is related to adultery, and people also relate her to her ability, so it's a game of P's as well as A's. This is but a part of the novel's symbolism introduced by the author, because if we analyze other scenes and words, we can discern many more, like the meeting in the forest between Esther and Arthur, which brings back to mind Adam and Eve, or some words recalling Shakespeare, which are the very same used in the Hamlet, and even some dualisms between light and dark, which are reminders of Milton, typical of his Paradise Lost, or the moments of self-awareness that only occur near the forest, pictured as a natural pre-Christian place free of the religious dogmas of the time. Something very close to Thoreau's transcendental themes, who saw it as a place to reflect on society as a whole, and as such to rediscover oneself, the very place where we can find Esther contemplating her life at the end of the novel, after the death of her lover and the departure of her Pearl towards Europe, trying to think of her future, swearing by different principles that almost predate what will then be feminism. The novel gave birth to numerous adaptations, the most famous of which is certainly the one from 1995, directed by Roland Joffe and starring Demi Moore, Gary Oldman and Robert Duvall. The film, however, did not meet the expectations, starting with the box office earnings, which barely covered one-third of the film's budget, and with the critical reception decidedly negative. The film was nominated for 7 Razzie Awards, which are awards specially made for particularly bad pieces of work, and won one for Worst Sequel or Remake in 1995. The only positive notes are the technical contributions, starting with Alex Thompson's cinematography and with Gabriella Pescucci's costumes, while all the rest, sadly, misrepresented and ridiculed. The novel with inexistent Indian uprisings, an uneven language, and symbolic scenes far from those of the book. The movie, furthermore, depicts a deeply different Esther, almost closer to a heroine for women's right and independency. But most importantly, it turns the unforgiving ending of the book, in which Dimmesdale acknowledges his child and dies in front of the village because of the emotion in Esther's arms, into a classic happy ending, leaving Dimmesdale alive and happy with Esther, until their child turned 13. Beyond these changes, which already misrepresent the novel on their own, a moral point of view is lacking, as everything is strongly focused on being politically correct. The film lacks those strong roots that Hawthorne so carefully laid, making the novel an American masterpiece. The actors are mostly distant from their roles, with a Demi Moore who misrepresents her character, depicting her as a beautiful, sensual, and passionate woman as opposed to the strong but humble person depicted in the book. Robert Duvall fails to bring to screen a psychologically strong character capable of inflicting unspeakable pain upon Dimmesdale, a Dimmesdale that Gary Oldman somehow manages to properly represent. In my opinion, the film doesn't succeed in transmitting the emotional charge that Hawthorne arms the novel with, but instead lacks in meaning and passion, a passion pictured as something else entirely. The novel speaks of very specific themes, and it is targeted to a specific kind of reader, trying to wake them up to the reality present at the time, while the movie simply depicts a love triangle. The author's skill was simplicity, a simplicity that the director should have approached with more respect, but then again, that is to be expected when the real meaning of something fails to be seen. The novel brings one to reflect upon many themes and creates a unique atmosphere, almost surreal in spite of the deep realistic nature of the work at hand. Those moments of contemplation are what really make it the masterpiece that it is. Those moments when time stops for you, bringing you to think of how much different things were back then, and just after a second that maybe they weren't that different after all. This, in my opinion, marks a perfect book, how current it can remain throughout the centuries.